Hello, Mike here. Now, a couple of videos ago, I asked the question, what is Amazon SageMaker? And we went through it and we talked about it, that it is kind of complex. There's lots of different parts to it. And there's a link to that video up in this top corner here if you want to go and take a look at that. During that video, I said that we'd sort of come back to SageMaker and have a look at little bits and pieces of it in action so we can see how we can use SageMaker to do machine learning workloads inside of AWS. Now, one of the things that SageMaker does is it handles the orchestration of infrastructure for us inside of AWS. So it deals with things like load balancers and API endpoints and the servers themselves that do the heavy lifting of machine learning training and the serving of an endpoint once we've got our model. And in this video, I want to show you exactly how to do that. Now, if you look at SageMaker, if you go into the console, you'll find that there are pre-built models already there that you can just go ahead and use. And if you use those, basically under the hood, there's a Docker container. So everything's built on containers, and that container's been pre-built by Amazon Web Services to do the job that that particular algorithm does. Now, you can also go into SageMaker and build your own containers. So if you know how to build Docker images and Docker containers, you can do that, build those up and use those with SageMaker to build your training inferences and your inference endpoints and things like that. But what about something in the middle? That's what we're going to look at today. What if you've got some code, you've written some Python-based code, for example, and you want to use that in your machine learning projects, and you just essentially want to turn the dial up and give it some production grade infrastructure to run just the script that you created. That's what we're going to do in this video. So what I've done is this. I've put together a really simple machine learning project. It is so super simple that it's really kind of trivial, but that's kind of the point for us today, is that that project is so simple that that's not the subject of this video. This video is about what we do with that project and how we get it up and running inside of SageMaker. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through the project that I've got. It's just code that I've got running inside of a regular notebook. I'm actually using SageMaker Studio, but I could use SageMaker Notebooks, and I could even just run this on my local machine if I had a notebook server running there. That's the easy part. That's not the focus as such, but we'll look at the code I've got there. The code I've got will train the model and it will persist the model to disk. And then we'll also have bits and pieces of code in there to take it off disk and make inference with it again. Now, all of that will happen locally, as in I'm going to be running it in SageMaker Studio, but it'll happen within the notebook itself. Then once we've got that code and we understand how that works, we'll wrap it up in such a way that we can give it to SageMaker, and SageMaker will then be able to run it at scale. So it'll be able to do the model training at scale, bring many multiple instances in, and we'll be able to do the inference at scale as well. Now, this project is super small, so we don't need that scale. But again, this is just about the demonstration of how we would do that with SageMaker running in a certain mode called script mode. So we're going to put a script together and we're going to use that. So we don't have to build our own Docker images. We don't have to build those containers. SageMaker is going to do it all for us. All right, let's jump into the Jupyter Notebook and I'll show you. And look, I'll put a link to this Jupyter Notebook beneath this video as well. So go and take a look down there for the GitHub repository for this notebook. And while you're looking at that, maybe give this video a like as well, because that really helps me to spread the word about these videos I'm putting together. All right, let's take a look at what we've got here. I've got this split up into several sections and each one sort of works in its own right. Let's step through it. The very first thing that I have in this project is I'm going to create a data set. That is obviously not necessarily something you would do like this in a notebook, but I'm using scikit-learn for all of the code here. You could do exactly the same as what I'm showing you here with something like TensorFlow or MXNet or whatever, but I'm using scikit-learn because it's super simple, super easy, and we're just going to do a simple linear regression problem. And I'm going to use scikit-learn to actually generate a data set that I can use to train. Why am I doing that rather than getting a abalone data set or something? Well, this is really easy. You can also run this code and mimic the same thing or you can slot in your own data set if you want to. So let's just get on with this. This first set is going to create the data set. So it's not really the machine learning part as such. I'm just going to import these libraries. You'll also note here that I'm importing Pickle. Pickle is what I'm going to use to serialize the data objects that I've got so that I can save them on disk. So I can serialize the data set in this case and save that data set as a file on disk. So I've just imported the libraries. I'm now going to use the scikit-learn datasets library to make a regression dataset. And I'm just passing in some values here so that I get 100 data points on, broadly speaking, a linear path that the model will be able to find later. So let's hit play on that. And look, I'm just going to print out X to the screen here. So now you can see here are 100 data points. These are the X values for the data points. The labels obviously in Y. It's a very, very simple data set. Okay, let's scroll past these. And let's get down to this next cell here. This is one of the important cells for us. It's going to actually serialize with Pickle that data set down into a file. And we're going to call that train.pickle. And you'll note that there's already a train.pickle in the repository, in the GitHub link that I've sent. But this is us basically creating another one. So I press play on that, it'll run, and you'll see that this this file will go to seconds ago, last modified train.pickle. So now we have a data set ready to go. All right, this is where the machine learning part comes in, but it is super simple machine learning. We're going to do a linear model, a linear learner on here, and do a linear regression. So the thing we're going to do is we're going to import the linear model libraries from scikit-learn. I do also import Pickle again, just because I keep each of these sections of code modular so you could run them independently, but loading it again is no issue. And we're going to load the data set in now. So I'm not taking the data set objects from the ones in memory that I've just created. I'm essentially demonstrating how we import this data set from disk using load. And then we go and grab ourselves an instance of the model, the linear regression model from scikit-learn. And then we call fit, model fit, on the data we've just loaded from that file. Okay, so we press play there. And guess what? The training takes no time at all because we're running here on a ML instance. I think it's a T3. It's going to chew through 100 records really, really quickly. But all of that there has just loaded in our data from disk and has trained a model. So if you look at that code as a section of code, that is one step. That's the training step. And we can use that in our script when we're looking at SageMaker script mode. So I just wanted to demonstrate essentially how the code works. Now let's go and do a prediction with our model. So we're going to take the model that we've just trained here and we're going to click play there. So this is taking the model that's in memory now inside of the notebook, and we've got these outputs. Now, if you're running this side by side, you'll have different values from this. But as we test and retest this model throughout this session, you should get the same answers as you get here, if that makes sense. So whatever answers you have here, you can benchmark against as you progress through. So essentially we've got, I'm just passing in 4 values, 0, 1, 2, and 3. They are values for X, and those values, the label of those, of the Y value, would be minus 0.17 and then 20 point something, 42 point something, 63 point something. It's our linear model. So this is all super simple stuff. The next thing that we need to see how we can do is to save the model that we've just created and save it on disk. So persist it to disk so that we can go and do something again with it later. So that's what this line does here. We're going to create a pickle dump of the actual binary, essentially, of the model that we've just created. So this is essentially serializing it. And then we're going to persist that to disk into model.pickle in the same way that essentially that we did with our data set. So now we have, apart from this notebook, we also have the data set that we used to train in the first place. And now we have a model that's been trained on this that we've saved onto the disk as well. So That's great. Let's just show how we can then pull that model off disk and then do some inference with it. Now we're doing that because we need to make sure that the code we pass to SageMaker is capable of doing it. So we're just experimenting around here. How does this code work? So let's go and import scikit-learn, linear regression, and Pickle. We don't have to do this, but again, I'm keeping it modular. So for the sake of clarity, I'll just run it now. And now let's go and load that model in. So we're loading it using Pickle, and we're loading in our model that we've literally just saved. And we're bringing that back into a variable or an object called loaded model, just to keep it distinct from the model that we've already got in memory. So we run that. And then, well, we've got it in memory, so can we use it to make predictions? So we're going to take loaded model, we're going to call predict, and we're going to pass the same values in that we did before, 0, 1, 2, and 3. We run that, and these values that we get here should be exactly the same. Now, it's doing the inference from a different version of, or different instance of the model, the one that we pulled off disk. So it's kind of a worthwhile test. Let's scroll up and we can see with both things on the screen there, then it's exactly the same values, which is exactly what we'd expect. Unless something horrible had gone wrong, nothing horrible has gone wrong. So this is good. So what we've just shown there is how with scikit-learn, we can train a model from a data set which is on disk. We've shown how we can persist that model to disk. Then we've shown how we can take that model off of the disk again and form and do an inference, perform an inference. So we've shown all of the different parts of the life cycle, if you like, of the machine learning project that we want to automate and we want to put at production scale in SageMaker. And this next section of the notebook is going to show us exactly how we do that. So let's just scroll down a bit here and we'll start stepping through what this looks like and how you would put together a project similarly with your own code. So the first thing to do is there's a couple of things we need to do, but we're going to import SageMaker SDK. We're going to import the scikit-learn estimator from the SageMaker SDK. So SageMaker is aware of, as first-class citizens, things like scikit-learn and TensorFlow, MXNet, stuff like that. So it's already got that built in, and we can refer directly to scikit-learn here. We also get to specify the specific version of scikit-learn that we want to use, and we'll have a look at that in just a moment. So let's go ahead and import those libraries. We're also importing Boto 3 for Python, and we're also going to import OS just so that we can get access to stuff that's on the drive. The next section down here is really just setting up SageMaker Session for us. So we're going to get access to the role. These are all default values. So the role that SageMaker is using, the session object that SageMaker is using, and from that we're going to get the default bucket. This is just an example of how SageMaker abstracts you away from needing to know about AWS infrastructure. Even as something as simple as the S3 bucket, you don't really need to know because the SageMaker session by default will create one for you, or we'll just use the default one in that particular region if one's already been made. So all of those are set up. Then we're going to have some other values we're just going to set up. This is just sort of good practice to keep things runnable in different accounts, essentially. So we've got our S3 prefix that we're choosing to use, so script mode workflow. Then we're setting up some Pickle prefixes. These are just string values for convenience sake to make this code portable, essentially. And then we set up what directory we want our training directory to be. So let's go ahead and click run on that. It's really just setting up some values there. The next section down, in fact, the next few sections is really just setting up some values that we're going to use as we carry on. So this is looking at the S3 resource bucket and just getting it in a Boto 3 context, because what we're going to do here is we're going to upload our training data set into this S3 bucket. So it's going to be available in S3 land, because when you're working with SageMaker to train models, whether you're using the built-in algorithms or putting your own in place, S3 is really the place where you're going to source your data from. That's the training channel. You're going to specify where the data is. So we need to put the data up into S3. And that's what these 3 lines of code are going to do here, or 4 lines of code. You could do this in the console, of course, but we're just doing it with code here. So that's uploaded into S3. Next, we're going to specify some hyperparameters. Now, you'll notice when we did the original Python code at the beginning of this notebook, we didn't use Python parameters. We just called fit on linear regression and just did it. And that's because we were willing to accept the default parameters just for the case of just testing that. We're still going to use the default parameters. What I've done here is just extract those defaults out and explicitly define them here for no other reason than I want to sort of show you how you pass hyperparameters in case you want to change yours. So these are all the default parameters for the scikit-learn regression that we're doing. So, xcopy, fit intercept, and normalize all set up here. Again, this is just a data structure, so there's nothing much going on there. Then we're going to create an instance type. So what instance do we want to use? Again, we're just setting a string value here. We're just abstracting ourselves away, decoupling our code, making it kind of reusable. So we're going to call on an MLM5 large instance. That is a large instance. That's way bigger than is necessary for this particular project that we've got, but it's only going to be running for literally a few seconds, maybe a couple of minutes. So from a cost perspective, there's no problems there. And then we're going to specify the input training channel, essentially. This is the training channel, and we are pointing it to the location of the S3 data that we just uploaded a moment ago. So let's click run on that. Then we've got a few more parameters here. Now, the SageMaker SDK has a few top-level, high-level objects. The estimator is one of those, and that's what we're going to create in this cell here. We're going to create an estimator of type sklearn or scikit-learn, and we're going to pass in a bunch of parameters into that. Now, the top two parameters here are probably the most interesting from the point of view of what we're doing right here, right now. We're pointing it to a script. This script is on the local file system here, or it's inside of the SageMaker environment here, the SageMaker Studio environment, and it's up in this folder up here called script. We'll take a look at this in a minute. This script is actually a Python script version of our machine learning project. In other words, the code that we looked at earlier on in this notebook. So it specifies how to deserialize the data from the training. It specifies how to do the training, how to persist the model, how to load the model, and how to do inference. So each of those steps that we looked at in detail before, they are actually codified into that script. And we'll take a look at that script in just a moment after we've just gone through some points here about the setup of this estimator. So that's essentially what those two are there. Then we've got here the framework version. So we get to specify which framework from sklearn we want to use. The Python version, the instance type, just pulling in those strings that we defined before. Instance count. Now, we only want one. We barely even need one. But if we wanted to have multiple instances, we can get SageMaker and the SageMaker SDK to abstract us away from the complexities of parallelizing and bringing up more instances for us. We then pass in our hyperparameters that we set before. These hyperparameters will get passed to that script that I was talking about, and I'll show you how it does that. The role, so in other words, the role that this whole thing's going to work as, this is the default one that's set up with SageMaker for us before. And then we've got a base job name, so a name that we want to give to this training job so that we can track it and follow it if we want to do that. And all of those parameters get passed into an estimator. So let's just click run on that. Obviously it happens very quickly because it's really just doing some configuration there. This next cell here is the cell that essentially does the job. This is where we're going to tell SageMaker, go off, grab this script and run it in a script container. So you deal with all that container stuff. I've got the code. Just go make this work. I don't want to deal with infrastructure. Come back and tell me when you've finished training my model. And of course, if you've got a vast data set, if it's enormous, then that might be some hours later, some days later, potentially. But in this case, it's going to finish very, very quickly. So let's go ahead and press run on that cell. And you'll notice that this is going to take a couple of minutes to run because it's starting the training job. It's going to load the data. It's going to follow all those steps through. Now, if you've done this kind of thing before with the built-in algorithms, for example, inside of SageMaker, you'd be kind of familiar with what's going to happen here. But whilst this is starting, let's go and take a look at that script and see the anatomy, if you like, of that script and how we need to format that script so it'll work. So if I just go into the script folder here and pull back script.py and just open that in another tab here, then you can see this is just Python code. This isn't a notebook. This is the Python code that we are passing into SageMaker. And you'll notice in here is essentially the same code that we explored further up into that notebook before, with a couple of additions and structured in a certain way so that SageMaker can hook into it and pull the necessary functions as required. So the first one here is pass args. This is the arguments that are passed into this code from the outside world. So this is going to be things like the hyperparameters that get passed in. It's going to be things like the locations of the training data and potentially the testing data. You can extend this out further than the simple example that we've put in here. So that's what's passed in here. You've got some opportunities to set up some defaults. This is kind of boilerplate, and you'd kind of like adjust this a little bit depending on the code that you have that's running elsewhere. Then we get into, well, the next one I have in here is load dataset. So this is a function with that specific name is called by SageMaker as required to load the dataset in. That's not quite true. It's not called by SageMaker. It's actually called from a function call inside of start. Sorry. So SageMaker calls start in order to train the model, and as part of that, we're going to go ahead and load the dataset. This is loading the dataset. And so the code I have in here essentially is pulling the dataset from the location that's passed in. So it's one of the arguments which is passed in. It says the data is here. We go and load that in, and then we load it in, we depickle it, we deserialize it. And because we know that this is working with pickle, we use pickle to depickle it. Depickle it, unpickle it, whatever. So that's what load dataset does. This is the main function here then called start. And this one is going to be called when the training process starts. It's what's happening right now behind the scenes. This code is running in a container somewhere. All of it's managed by SageMaker. It's not running inside the SageMaker Studio. They're in no way related to SageMaker Studio. We've made a call on SageMaker, the API endpoints using the SDK, and it's doing all of that stuff for us now. So what's it doing? Well, it's basically doing everything that we did before, plus a little bit. So it's giving us an opportunity to load in hyperparameters, and then it's basically going ahead and doing the training from the dataset which has been passed in. It's got some exception handling. It's, again, boilerplate code. Feel free to adapt it to your own project. Once it's done that, then it's going to dump that model out onto the file system inside of the container. And that's it. We've got our trained model sat inside of our container. We've basically kind of built a container. We've built that project, but we haven't had to do any Docker Compose. We've not had to do any of that building of the container ourselves. Okay, once that's done, we've got a couple of functions down here, and they're involved with the inference side of things. So one of them will load the model. So we know the location of it. It's passed into model FN, and basically it loads the model, depickles it. It's a deserialization function. That's what this does. And then we perform the inference. And again, super simple here. So really all it's doing is saying, well, we've got a model, call predict on that, using the data that we're passing in. Super, super easy stuff. All right, that is basically how you structure together your Python code such that it'll work in SageMaker script mode. So, of course, the important ones to have there are pass args, start, and predict function. I guess you need to do the model load function, model function as well to load it. Those are the important parts in there. Let's go back to our notebook here. We see that this is actually finished, which we kind of expected in this kind of time frame. And if we go through all the verbose stuff, yeah, billable seconds 117. So it basically took a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah, and that's all the time we'll be billed for. Now, something I want to show you is if we go into the SageMaker console itself, so this is sort of back to the AWS console. Well, if we go in here and look in training, and we look in training jobs, then you'll see a whole bunch of stuff in here because this list never clears out. kind of like it too at some point, but never mind. And what we can see up the top here is the linear regression model with the date and time from now. It took 3 minutes and it's complete. So here is the actual job, showing you that it ran inside of SageMaker, inside of the infrastructure. We didn't have to deal with it, do anything about it. Yes, there's one just underneath it, which is quite like it, because I ran this not that long ago, just to make sure it works. And then stuff from years ago, because I've been using this account for all kinds of stuff. So there it is inside of the SageMaker console. That's the job that actually just completed. So if we go back to our SageMaker Studio environment, I've got a bit more code in here that we can use. So we've just gone ahead and done the model training. Now we can also use SageMaker to stand up an inference endpoint. So we can take essentially that job that we've just done and ask SageMaker, take the inference code and that model and just go and stand up a production quality inference endpoint in whatever infrastructure we need to run that. And so we do that in really just one line here. So we're going to grab the estimator that it's already in memory. So if you don't have the estimator currently there, you'd have to sort of go and grab that from that training job. So we go grab that estimator and we say go deploy. And we tell it the number of instances we want to have. So how busy are we expecting this to be? Not very busy. So we barely even need one instance, but we do need one. The instance type. So we're going to go again for an ML M5 large, way overkill. And we're not going to leave this running for very long. It's just for demo. And then the endpoint name. And we're calling this linear regression endpoint because why not? So let's go ahead and click run on that. And this will take a minute or two just to stand that endpoint up. And we can keep an eye on that. Well, we've got the output, which is slowly going to be shown here beneath the cell. We can also go into the SageMaker console as well and have a look. So whilst that's loading, let's go to the SageMaker console, go to inference, and have a look down here. So if we go to models, then we should see in here, yes, we've got our linear regression model here, which has just recently been created. We have two in here. One is recently being created with this particular demonstration. And we can go down to endpoints, and we should see that there's an endpoint currently being created. So we have status of creating, and this is our linear regression endpoint. So I'm just going to sit here and press refresh a couple of times and wait for this to come online. And I guess because this is not particularly big, it didn't take that long, just a couple of minutes to come up. And you see now status is in service. So if we go back to our Jupyter Lab environment, yes, it's got an exclamation mark, which means that it's finished. Also, we can see that the execution of that cell has finished as well. So there's one more thing to do. We've got our endpoint up. It's there. It's production ready. Let's go and use it to actually perform inference. And whilst this is a completely different model to the model that was trained up at the beginning of the notebook. It was trained on the same data with the same method, so we should get the same answer. But it was trained independently on a different set of infrastructure. So let's give this a go. We've got the predictor here. We're calling predict on this particular thing that we've just deployed, the prediction endpoint. Let's click run with the same values that we used before, 0, 1, 2, and 3. And those are the answers we get back. So minus 0.17, 20 point something, 42 point something, and 63 point something. How's your memory from earlier on in the video? Let's scroll up and yeah. Minus 0.17, 20 point something, 42, and 63 point something. So there you go. It's now up and running in SageMaker, completely independent of this notebook, and it's ready for all of our production data. So let's take a quick look at what we've just done. We have defined essentially a simple machine learning project using scikit-learn for a linear regression. We looked at code of how we were going to be able to train the model, persist the model to disk, load the model from disk, and then do another do inference on that model. Once we've sort of figured out how that code worked, we could put it into this script.py, this Python script with a certain particular format, right? Different functions in here for those different parts of the life cycle. So passing the arguments that it's sent in, starting, doing the training, loading the model, and then doing prediction. With all of those hooks in there, SageMaker could take that code and run it in SageMaker infrastructure, SageMaker managed infrastructure, which could be enormous, running at scale, far bigger than I could do on my local machine, far bigger than I'd be willing to have an instance run my SageMaker notebook, for example, because it just wouldn't make sense to do it that way. So there you go. And then essentially, ultimately, once we've done that and trained the model, we've created our inference endpoint and shown that it works and it's up and running now. So I hope that was useful. I wanted to show you how you could take your code and apply it in the SageMaker environment, because I think that's what makes it really powerful, is when you combine SageMaker together with the kinds of work that you were doing already. If you did enjoy this video, then I appreciate it if you give it a like. Any questions you've got, please put them into the comments below. I do my best to try and answer every single comment that gets put down there. Let me know if there's any other kinds of videos you'd like to see on this channel as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.